Okay.
This is J.J. Pianki of the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign interviewing David Plath on August 11th, 2017 at the University Library. Where and when were you born?
Elgin, Illinois, 8 December 1930.
Who are or were your parents and what were their occupations?
You want their names? Yeah. Ernest Carl Plath was my father. Laura Emmedell Plath, my mother. My mother was a housewife. My father ran a small furniture store for most of his life.
Do you have any siblings?
I have two who are still alive. My sister, the oldest, died a couple of years ago. My older brother is still alive, but senile. My younger brother is doing well.
Did any of them serve in the military?
No.
What were you doing before you entered the service?
In high school and then college. So I entered college on the Naval ROTC program.
What branch of the military did you serve in?
Well, this was U.S. Naval Reserve on active duty with the Pacific Fleet, 1952 to 1955.
Why did you choose the Navy?
Probably because it offered the most scholarship support. As I'm planning to go to college, I knew my grades were good enough I could get some fellowship support. I didn't want to depend on my father. I knew he would mortgage the house to make sure that his kids could go to college, but I didn't want to put that burden on him. So I checked. I think I could have gotten, this was Northwestern University. I think I could have gotten some fellowship aid, but nothing comparable to that, the ROTC program then, which not only paid tuition fees, but gave you living expenses. It wasn't quite enough to live on, but boy, it meant do a little side work from time to time and you could get by. So there was no particular attraction. I was pleased that it was the Navy. More pleased than maybe had been the Army. I was always proud to wear the Navy blue, but it wasn't because it was the Navy so much as they offered the best deal.
Makes sense. What happened when you departed for training camp and during your early days of training? Because even though you did ROTC, I presume you had to do boot camp.
I'm sorry?
Even though you did ROTC, I presume you had to do boot camp. Is that correct?
Not a boot camp as such, because we had summer training cruises that were
Okay.
usually 6 to 8 weeks. So those were good because I'd never seen an ocean before. I'd seen Lake Michigan. I knew what it was to be a big body of water where you can't see the far shore. So that was part of the excitement. Got to go to California. Got to go to two training cruises on the East Coast, Gulf Coast. This was great.
So what was training like? Was it hard? Was it easy? Fun? Boring? What'd you do?
Well, some of all of the above, but most of the time, because we were traveling to interesting places, learning a lot because you're on different kinds of ships. And one of the junior year training crews involved Quantico, Virginia, the Marine Training Center. So I had four weeks there, and then 3 or 4 weeks at Pensacola, where we actually got to put our hands on planes, but not really fly them. I mean, you could steer it for a little bit. Well, you have to understand, this is 1948 to 52. After 1950, with the Korean action, the Navy's got money again. But in the late 40s, we wore hand-me-down uniforms. The Navy was really up against it financially. So some of our projected training cruises were actually cut short because they decided they didn't have enough money to buy oil to move the ships another couple of weeks.
Gotcha. Do you recall your instructors, and if so, what were they like?
ROTC? Yeah, most, if not all of them, of course, were just out of wartime service during World War II. There was at least one that I was totally admiring of. I mean, he just had that command presence, and yet he was very, very friendly. I found a lot of the actual instruction kind of boring. Well, these were officers who were assigned to this for a 2 to 4 year period.
Right.
They were not people who had wanted to become teachers, particularly. Although, to its credit, one of the things I came away from was a deep respect for the Navy's concern for continuing training and education. We were always involved in some kind of training or maneuvers.
So always keeping your skills sharp.
Well, it was a little like a continuation of school. But all the better because you're traveling around, not stuck on campus.
There you go. Did you receive any specialized training, and if so, what?
Yeah, because I was assigned to the Amphibious Corps, and the base is in Coronado, California, we had several different kinds of short-term training in amphibious, and of course continuing training over the years in practice amphibious operations. But initially, making sure you could do survival swimming. And actually for me that was great because I never really developed a good sense of myself in water until then. You know, I had some lessons in high school and college, but I was a dog paddler until I got this survival skill. You know, and since then, not a boast, but drop me in the middle of the ocean. Okay, I know I can stay afloat. This is not distance swimming or anything. This is just keeping your head together and keeping yourself afloat. But so that was part of it. There was training in firefighting. You could fire on a ship. There were mock-up ship compartments where you have to go in and actually take some hoses in and fight a fire. That was interesting. Then on shipboard, as I said, there were frequent maneuvers, going out for a weekend and running the small boats up to the beach, things like that. Second year that I was in the Navy, I'd been on the ship for a couple of years, and I thought, maybe I can do something else. Where can I go to school for a while? I thought hard about signing up for Pensacola and flight training, but that would require a 3-year extension of service. And I said, I'm not sure I want to give 3 years. So the next longest thing I could sign up for without having to re-enlist for any period of time was Naval Justice School in Newport, Rhode Island. So we were there, that was about 2 months. And it was great. I'd never studied law before. Went back to the ship then as the ship's law officer. Not an attorney, but 1948, Uniform Code of Military Justice was passed. Well, this was only 4 years earlier. The general feeling or policy, whether it was a policy or not, in the military at that time was that a lot of people in long-term military personnel really don't understand that uniform code yet. So part of our job was to give instruction on the code. And I liked that a lot. I was really interested. Again, it was schooling. Well, another part of it is that while the ship was around various countries, the waters around various countries in East Asia, we spent more time around Japan than any single other place. And, had shore leave fairly often. wandered around Japan a bit and got really interested in Japan. And so I said, well, why don't I apply for shore duty in Japan? So I was assigned after 2 years on the ship, I was assigned for the third year as a legal and discipline officer at a small Navy communications facility outside Yokohama. So that was a totally different kind of learning. And really, East Asia and all those experiences shaped my life from there on. I've been, what should I say? As an undergraduate, I was a journalism major. I'd actually worked for the local newspaper in Elgin after high school for a few months. So I generally figured once I got out of the Navy, I'd go into journalism. Well, for a variety of reasons, the interest in Japan, and I'm starting to read anthropology. I thought, journalism is a very noble profession. Anthropology may be a little better because you're a journalist without deadlines.
Makes sense.
Yeah. So it shaped my professional career, not only in anthropology, but mainly involved in Japan. I think another motivation had to do with high school.
How so?
If you've never read it, one of the great but not often noticed bits of American reportage is a book called Is There Life After High School? And his thesis is, don't we spend most of our life after high school either living up to or down from what we were in high school? He finds that Richard Nixon, Gerald Ford, several U.S. presidents failed to be elected class president. So he tracks down the guys who were elected. And basically what they said was, if you've been president of your class, who wants to be president of the U.S.? But specifically in my case, one of the things was, I was advised to take 2 years of Latin in high school, which I did. Hated it, except for etymologies. That was fun. But it was a dead language. Never got very good, to the point where the instructor after 2 years said, Dave, you're hopeless. Don't ever bother to try to learn languages. Well, I had to prove that I could. It never happened, but there was this image, someday I'm going to go back to high school, and if Miss Irene is still there, I'm going to say, Miss Irene, you're absolutely right. The only language I've ever mastered is Japanese.
And did you become fluent in Japanese?
Yeah.
Good job.
In graduate school, I was obliged to teach myself to read scientific French, but I never learned to speak it. I had no instruction per se. It was enough to pass a doctoral prelim that required knowledge of at least one European language. So it wasn't easy, but I could and can read anthropological reports. And because at that time, in graduate school, there was nothing called Japanese studies. So my doctoral degrees read anthropology and Far Eastern languages. There wasn't even a Far Eastern studies program.
Nice.
So I had quite a bit of instruction in classical Chinese. I can still stumble through documents with a dictionary in hand, but it's not a skill I've used much, so it's really kind of faded. But these were the kinds of things that got shaped by that experience in Japan. And there's something else. Realize I'm in high school during World War II. I'd never met a Japanese. The only pseudo-Japanese I ever saw were those in wartime films, who actually I learned later were all Koreans because no Japanese or Japanese Americans were allowed on the West Coast.
Right.
But, you know, these bucktooth guys shooting down poor old Ronnie Reagan. You know, I'm not sure I totally believed it at the time, but, you know, they were portrayed as the ultimate evil in the universe. I'm a Midwest boy. If you're from the Midwest, part of your view of humankind is anybody who doesn't have a sense of humor is not quite fully human. And so I get to Japan and I'm thinking, are these people human or not? You know, I have a fantastic sense of humor. So I think part of what has shaped me ever since the early 1950s, it's a question you can't answer directly, but is this question, how can people who are the ultimate evil in the universe have such a fantastic sense of humor? I think that's powered me through, not that I'm going to get an answer to that, but that conundrum to keep working on.
So your time over there as part of the Navy eventually shaped sort of the things you wanted to know when you went to grad school and then started your professional career.
Yeah, because I just found very quickly developed wonderful friendships with Japanese. Yeah. Even though 10 years earlier we would have been shooting at each other.
Right. How did you adapt to military life, including the physical regimen, barracks, food, and social life?
Relatively easily. For me, what I found was, there were times when I rebelled a little bit, of course, in the early months, but never to the point where I got in serious trouble. But food was good. Hot showers every night. Travel. You're a bachelor with actually more because we weren't in port that often. More money than I was likely to spend up. I saved a lot of it. It helped for tuition in grad school. So for me it was almost a vacation. I mean, yes, you have to accept the fact that you're under all sorts of restrictions. Sometimes they're petty and silly. But if you can live with that, it's a good life. Once in a while, I did think even of re-enlisting. And I like sea duty so much, being out there in the middle of the ocean. I even thought if the Navy would guarantee me permanent sea duty, I'd sign up. But, what's likely to happen, you get stuck in some atoll in the South Pacific for 3 years, bored out of your skull, except for spearfishing or something like that. And I didn't want to risk that. And I didn't have any particular ambition about going up in rank and whatnot. Also, I realized very early on, reserve officers rarely make admiral. So if you have any ambitions for high command, forget it. Not impossible, but almost. And I thought, if I'm going to stay in for 30 years, I'd want to have, maybe someday have command of my own ship. Well, you got to move up to do that.
Yeah.
So I didn't see any real problem. And in a sense, being on the ship, because we had about at least 20 junior officers, most of whom had come through the ROTC program like me. It was kind of like being in a college dorm. You went out in gangs in the evening if you were on shore. Have dinner or maybe taking a show or whatever.
Where were you stationed?
Well, the first 2 years, the USS Renzo, which was an amphibious attack ship, home port San Diego, so we spent a lot of time in San Diego and doing exercises, training exercises up and down the Southern California coast. The third year, I was at the U.S. Naval Communications Facility, Kamiseya, Japan. It's about 10 miles west of Yokohama. And that in many ways was nice too, because it was a very small radio facility. It was part of the big Yokosuka Naval Base, but separate. So we didn't have all the I'm trying not to take sailor terms. Didn't have all the spit and polish and formalities that you have on a big naval base.
Right. A little more relaxed.
Much more relaxed. And interesting in its own way. Now, I said I was legal and discipline officer, but it turned out I had very few duties. Well, because this was, aside from 20 or 30 ordinary seamen who manned the main gate, the rest of them were all electronics technicians, many of them with master's degrees, or they were studying for master's degrees. Well, they didn't get into trouble, most of them. They might go off for a beer or two after work, but they came back and took correspondence courses and things like that. So there were little discipline problems from time to time, but only once or twice we had anything big, and that was almost always with the ordinary sailors, some of whom got into drug problems, and one of whom drove his car and killed somebody. There were a couple of things like that. So I had lots and lots of daytime hours at my desk. So I said, I'm going to study Japanese. So I signed up for a night course in a Tokyo university. We were about an hour by suburban train out of Tokyo, so I could get in, go to class, have a nice dinner, come back. It was a good life in many ways.
Oh, yeah. Nice.
Now I know you haven't asked yet about libraries.
Oh, we'll get there. So what were some of your, you've talked a little bit about your experiences. What other kind of memories of your time abroad do you have? Other than studying Japanese and kind of hanging out on the base, did you partake in any recreation?
We were never in any combat. The only amphibious operation in the Korean conflict had taken place 2 years before, and very successful landing at Incheon. And of course the Amphibious Corps was very proud of that, but during the 2 years that I was there, we were in Korean waters from time to time. Once or twice we were close enough to where there were combat operations going on somewhere on shore. You could hear artillery and things like that, but that's the closest I ever got to it. Didn't really get to see much of Korea, because we put in to port from time to time. Occasionally we transported combat troops from Japan to Korea or back again, and occasionally we took on either Army or Marines and took them off and did practice amphibious attacks. But, I got to see a fair part of East Asia, lots of Japan, because we put into several different ports over the years, parts of Korea. And it was interesting. One of my best students is Korean, and so I've spent a lot of time with him in Korea in recent years. A couple, 3 years ago, he invited me to go with him to an annual Korean anthropology conference on one of the towns on the southwest tip of the peninsula. And we went out in a boat because they wanted to take a little excursion to a small island where one of the senior faculty had done his first field research many years ago. We got out there and I suddenly realized my ship had passed here decades ago, and I remembered. So things like that. We got to Hong Kong for a few weeks because various ships were periodically assigned to be what was called a station ship in Hong Kong. I mean, you were there basically to rescue any Americans if there were, if there was going to be some kind of Chinese action. So, you know, got to see a little bit of Hong Kong. Got off and got to walk around some of the islands as well as Victoria.
Mm-hmm.
We were in the Philippines for a while. At the Subic Bay base, which no longer, you know, the Philippines took back some years ago. We were there for several weeks because we had to have repairs on our engine. Okinawa, for a brief period of time, we did some exercises there. So, you know, I got around a bit.
So when you were on ship in the first 2 years, were you, and you talk about being on an amphibious ship, were you like one of the drivers of one of the amphibious vehicles?
Yeah, the reason there were 25 junior officers, ordinarily, if you were just a transport, you wouldn't need more than 8 or 10 officers, but we had 30 small boats.
Okay.
We were equipped to land 3,000 troops. We could carry 3,000 troops. It was a little snug. We never had that many.
Mm-hmm.
But from time to time, we did serve as just an ordinary transport. So not only did you have more officers than ordinarily you'd have on a ship that was just transport, more enlisted men, because you had to have a lot more cooks and
to feed,
crew to take care of these people when they were on. And at least a couple of times when we were in port in South Korea, combat troops were taken off the front line and brought aboard for 3 days with us. They could have hot showers, they could relax, they had no duties, nice food and whatnot. R&R for 3 days. So a couple of times I got the chances to talk with them about what it was like to be in combat.
right.
So yeah, it was an interesting kind of ship to be on because it did so many different things. I haven't mentioned most of the time before I came back as so-called legal officer, and I didn't have many legal duties on that ship. My main assignment for the time I was on there was as ship secretary. I think they figured, well, he was in journalism, he must know how to write. But basically what it was, we had a small office with about 5 yeomen who did all the filling out of forms. And that, that was good duty too, because in port you were often very busy. At sea there were some forms to fill out and things like that, but you had a lot of free time at sea. And I loved it at sea. Sitting, when you're not busy with other things, sitting on deck and reading.
Nice.
Yeah, very nice. So yeah, the shipboard duty was good.
What kinds of friendships and camaraderie did you form while serving, and with whom?
A couple, well, mainly one of my, we were 4 to a stateroom. So one of the 4 with me. We continued to be in contact for probably about 10 years after we were discharged. He was an interesting guy because his ambition in life was to become a vintner. And
Okay.
he did. And so I can't remember if I met him again after that, but we corresponded, and I followed him through going to France and getting his vintner training in California and whatnot.
Mm-hmm. Nice.
Yeah. Others from time to time, not frequent and not recently, but probably about 10 years ago one time, one of the yeomen who worked for me in that office contacted me. We never quite managed to get together, but he remembered me. So.
Cool. How did you stay in touch with family and friends back home?
Lots and lots of letters. In fact, I have in the closet at home, my parents saved all the letters I wrote.
Oh, wow.
And one of these days, I want to open them up. And I've even thought, maybe I could do a little book, just with excerpts, something like that. But I haven't opened up that part of my past yet. Well, right now I'm dealing with archivists here, getting U of I archives ready, and that's a big enough job. I haven't tackled the family photos or this box full of my letters. I wrote fairly frequently. Well, a couple times I was able to get, when we were in Portland, San Diego, I was able to get away for 10 days or 2 weeks and come home.
Nice. What did you do for recreation or when you were off duty?
It varied, initially, probably most of the time, 3 or 4 of us would go off and see a musical show, have dinner, things like that. And that was learning for me too, because as a kid, we didn't go to restaurants very much. It wasn't until I got out of college. I'm exposed to all kinds of cuisine I hadn't known about before. But also, San Diego, even at that time, had a very good musical theater, and of course movies and things like that. You go drinking occasionally, but very rarely to get drunk. Sometimes, later on, I had a car, and sometimes by myself, usually, I'd drive around parts of Southern California.
Nice. When you were in the service, did you read for pleasure, and if so, what?
Yes. You may not know. I don't know about today. Probably today, men in the U.S. Navy, if they're standing in line on payday or standing in line for chow, probably are all looking at their cell phones. Those days, you automatically had a book in your back pocket. So if you were stuck in a line, and officers not often, but sailors all the time, you read. I don't know, of course, today, at that time, one of the big surprises was that even on a ship like that, it was a very well-stocked library. Somebody had very able librarians making the selection. So you had classics, but you had technical texts, a great selection of recent general books, nonfiction and fiction. So, and in our little stateroom, there was a bookshelf about like this. So most people on that ship were doing a lot of reading. I did a lot of reading. That was where I stumbled in to start reading about Japan, books about Japan, but also books about anthropology. Because they had probably 8 or 10 very recent, not textbooks, but general books about what anthropology is. So, and again, at the shore station where I was too, there was a good small library. I didn't expect that from, well, you think military, it's all macho stuff and technical stuff and whatnot. No, I was pleased. Some of the men who worked for me would come from time to time and look at my shelf, and they would say, "Do you have, is there a book on such and such?" I'd give them advice on what might be in the library. Now, I have to confess that though I used the library constantly before I retired, I haven't used it so much since. I will very soon, because I have a new project I'm going to get started on, and I will need use. But this is a great library. You know that.
Yeah.
I don't have to tell you that. And you know, as I do, that there's no substitute for walking the stacks. And I proselytized hard with my students who said, "Why go in the stacks?"
That's true. What particular book would you say influenced your life the most, and why?
Oh, it's hard to pick a single one. particularly if we're talking about life in general. In terms of my professional career, Ruth Benedict's The Chrysanthemum and the Sword, which I first read when I was on the ship. And what that book did, and I think that was more than any other single book, what got me to thinking, maybe anthropology is a pretty exciting profession. It wasn't so much that I felt that she really had answered all I wanted to know about Japan, but she gave me the idea that answers were possible. And I've undoubtedly read that book more times than any other book. I don't know, I couldn't give you a number, but certainly a couple dozen times over the years. I suspect I've read it more than I've read it times than I've read any of my own books.
Well,
So, you know, it's been a continuing beacon for me of what anthropology can do.
How did you return home?
How did I return home?
So you did 3 years in the service or 4 years?
It was 3 years.
3 years.
Yeah, actually, you know, initially when we joined the ROTC, it was 2 years. But with, you know, with an escape clause, if there's a national emergency, you can be extended.
Right.
So we were extended for a 3rd year. The Korean conflict started my sophomore year. Well, the summer of after my sophomore year. So, you know, it was still peacetime when we started.
Right.
Peacetime in a Navy that didn't have any money. How did I return home? I'm trying to think. Probably on the California Zephyr, because I was mustered out in San Francisco.
So you took Amtrak home. Took Amtrak home.
Well, now it's Amtrak, but then it was the Burlington and the Denver, Rio Grande Western and the Western Pacific. Three lines connected. But right, I don't know, within 2 or 3 weeks after that, my younger brother had gotten us a summer job at some sort of, I think it was a high school in Palo Alto, so I was to drive him out, and my parents went along. We made a big Western driving trip for several weeks.
Nice.
But, you know, after that, I settled down to get ready for something called graduate school, which I had no idea what that was like. Well, neither of my parents went to college. My mother graduated from high school. My father left school after 5th grade to help support a widowed mother. Now, my older siblings had gone to undergraduate school. But, you know, for my parents, graduate school, that was something you couldn't even think of, but even college was, you know, this strange universe that they had no experience of.
Where did you do graduate work?
Harvard.
Harvard. How were you received by your family and community when you returned home?
Oh, hi, you're back. I think that's probably most people's experience. You know, all this stuff you want to talk about, but
No one wants to hear.
well, I'm not sure that they don't want to hear. I figured they didn't know how to ask, and I wasn't quite clear about how to cue them to ask. And you know, it's the same way when you do anthropological field work. You come back, oh, you're back. Yeah, I've been 18 months in the field. I've got all this stuff I want to talk about.
Well, what would you have talked about if they'd known what to ask you? What were the things that you wanted to tell them?
Well, I probably would have talked more about Japan. They did ask about Japan a little bit. And in fact, I think it was one of my godfathers said to me one day, "Well, we really expected you to bring back a Japanese bride." Yeah, because my mind was so full of Japan. It had been so rich in experience. I might have talked about the Navy, but there wasn't that much to talk about.
So I take it your letters home was all about Japan when you lived there?
Okay.
Your letters home when you lived in Japan were all about Japan?
When I was in Japan, yeah. Probably a little bit about occasional court cases and things that I had to do as a legal officer, but there wasn't that much. Or yeah, because I had lots of time to weekends and occasionally get away for a few days. Drove around Japan, parts of Japan, which was also great. I didn't have a car, but several of the other junior officers had cars, and I could borrow their sports cars and things like that. Well, at that time, Japan was just starting its boom as an automotive country. So, in the big cities, streets were paved. Outside of the big cities, very few paved roads. And very few road signs. So you'd go from one village to the next and you'd say, well, where's the road to such and such? Those were just great times driving around.
Mm-hmm. How did you readjust to civilian life when you came back?
I suppose the quick answer is I just knuckled down and started studying in preparation for school. Something I'd been doing most of my life, so it was easy to do.
Have you remained in contact with or reunited with fellow veterans, and if so, who?
No, as I said, not in
really.
in recent years.
Are you a member of any veteran organizations, and if so, which?
No, I've never, not since I was in the Navy. My dad was very, very active in the American Legion, and so I was, and my brothers also were pretty active in the Sons of the American Legion, marching in the Drum and Bugle Corps and things like that.
Gotcha.
But I've never rejoined the Legion or any other veterans organization.
So since separating from the military, you went to graduate school, got your PhD in anthropology, and then what happened? Where'd you go? Did you just come here? Did you work somewhere else?
I was 2 years at Cal Berkeley, 3 years at the University of Iowa, and then here from 1966 to 1999.
And that's when you retired. Yeah. And now you're retired and living the easy life of a retiree, right?
Tell me about the easy life. No, because what I've continued to do is something I'd actually been doing earlier, is making documentary films, and anthropological documentary films. I still do that. And that's why I said I've got a project, I don't know when, but sometime in the next few months I want to start it up. That one will be about the Lahu, the people my wife studies in northern Thailand. I've got tons of video taken over the years, and I've only used it quite a while ago to make one documentary. I've got plenty of stuff for more, and I owe them, because of all the help that people give you. I owe them at least one more.
Sounds good. As a veteran, have you used your local library? Why or why not? As a veteran.
As a veteran, no.
How come? How come? Why?
Probably for the same reason I haven't used this library that much in the last 8 or 10 years. I love to riff through remainders catalogs. And I usually calculate, if it's less than $5, I might as well buy it, because by the time I drive to campus and pay the parking meter, so postal carrier keeps saying, "Why are you buying all these books?" But so often they're cheap enough. Now, you know, with the next documentary project, I'm going to need to do I'm going to need books that don't ordinarily appear in Remainder's catalogs. And what is evolved out of that further is that for most family events, such as the little gathering we're going to have in a couple of weeks, I arranged to have a book for everybody.
Nice.
Yeah.
That's pretty awesome.
So yeah, I'm still doing plenty of reading, but I just don't happen to be using libraries. Well, and the other thing, it's a minor inconvenience, but we've never quite overcome it. Savoy doesn't have a library. You have to go to Tolona. And there's no reason, 10-minute drive, but.
Understood. As a veteran, are there any programs or types of books available at the library that you enjoy more than others, or would enjoy?
Well, I still read a lot of books about various wars and military operations.
So history.
So, yeah, there would be, the general category would be history, yeah.
Okay.
No, probably not every time I order a batch of books, but almost every time, probably one or two about some war or some military operations.
Okay. As a veteran, is there something that you wish you could change about the library that would enhance your enjoyment of it?
Since I have been for a while, I can't really say.
Okay.
Sorry.
It's okay. How did your military experiences affect your life?
Well, the quick answer is that it shaped the direction of the rest of my life by taking me to the Far East, by giving me a chance to see a lot of places, by putting me in Japan, and getting beyond just a casual interest in another society. Yeah, without that. And I've often wondered, what if I'd been sent to the Atlantic Fleet instead of the Pacific? Would I really have gotten that interested in someplace in Europe? I don't know. Europe has never interested me as much as the Far East has.
Sure.
Well, in another way, that the travel and the travel to unusual places shaped my stance toward education. About 15 years later, I was here. I was offered an opportunity to take 31 undergraduates and 2 other faculty to lead this group for 9 months on a 9-month round-the-world study tour, an academic year.
Nice.
This was a jet-set junior year abroad.
Nice.
Yeah. And out of that came a feeling that there are things that can only be learned best in a campus, in a classroom, but there's so many other things that are better learned off a campus.
Mm-hmm.
And there was one time, fairly early years when I was on campus here, the administration had one of these rethink the university moments, and I was asked with a couple of others to come up with some ideas about how to change things. And I said, look, of course we need a timetable. Why don't we have a place table where you ask, where's the best place to learn this particular subject? Because, this is still the 1960s. As with that around the world junior year abroad, at that time the dollar was so strong, you could keep students overseas cheaper than on campus.
Sure.
And so it was a thinkable possibility. You could say, all right, send everybody, for this particular subject, send everybody to Guatemala for a semester. But of course, like all such administrative eruptions. Nothing ever happened. But yeah, it was the Navy experience, the overseas experience that shaped that kind of concern that I had. And later, I did serve as kind of point man in establishing our junior year abroad in Japan, which was, at that time we still didn't, this is the 1970s. We had 2 or 3 Europe programs. We had no Asia programs. And some in the administration were kind of worried. Oh, I kept saying, good God, Japan is a totally modern nation. What are you thinking about? This is, you don't have to worry about tropical diseases. And, but on the other hand, we also had some in the administration who were very much for it. This doesn't really, well, yes, in an indirect way it pertains to military experience, not mine. One of the things about this campus, probably most campuses in the 1960s and early 70s, many of the administrators had served in the military during World War II.
Sure. The
dean who hired me is in that iconic photo on the USS Missouri, where the Japanese are signing the surrender document. He's an officer up on, standing watching. And several, a number of the other top administrators had a military man's respect for Japan. I mean, the Japanese were a formidable enemy. And so there was this concern that attention be paid to Japan, not as an enemy. It helped in all sorts of informal ways develop the Japanese studies program here. Because there was an interest in it that you didn't have to fight for then. Now it's gone.
Right. Makes sense.
And our Japan program is almost dead. I mean, yes, we've got a small one going. We had a huge Japan program. Most of us were not replaced. Anyway, it does go back to military service, but not mine.
Yeah, sure. What are some life lessons you learned from military service?
That gets into deep philosophy. Oh, boy. It's a great question, but it's the kind of question that tends to invite flippant answers. Like, trust your own judgment, but go with the flow.
Is there a particular life lesson that you thought was the most important that you learned? Flippant or not?
It's a good question. I've just never thought about my Navy experience in those terms. So really, that's why I say I could give flippant answers, but I'm not sure I could. Without thinking about it for a while, I'm not sure I could give you a thoughtful answer.
Okay, it's fine. How has your military service impacted your feelings about war and the military in general?
Even before I was in the military, already by high school, and ever since then, I've thought that this country needs a volunteer military. A professional, I think we made a mistake 20, 30 years ago when we gave that up. I also think that everybody who is physically or mentally capable of doing so should do a couple of years of national service. It doesn't have to be in the military, but I think it was that was a major topic of national conversation back around the time I was in high school and college. I think, for me, it's a mistake that never was instituted.
So
I think that the discipline, the training, the self-respect that you develop, if you want lessons from them, the self-respect that you develop, the discipline that you develop from some form of service. And again, it doesn't have to be military service. Everybody needs that. Everybody deserves that.
So you're referring to mandatory service, like
Mandatory.
Switzerland or
Mandatory.
Korea?
Yep.
Okay.
And it can be, well, like the old Civilian Conservation Corps or something like that. Fine. I'm not AmeriCorps, Peace Corps.
What message would you like to leave for future generations who will hear this interview?
This country is based on volunteer service. As a citizen, you have a duty. I mean, I didn't join the military because of that kind of thing, but
It's what you think now, after having done it.
yeah.
Is there anything you feel we haven't discussed or should be added to this interview, and if so, what?
Always a good final question. Right now, offhand, not.
Okay.
When I walk out the door, I'll probably have several.
As soon as I turn the recorder off.
So, okay, no, that's it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's been fun to talk.
Yeah.
Well,